In this last video on Native American, about the time of European arrival, I'm going to look at some of the Native American peoples to the west of the Eastern Woodlands Indians. I'm not going to spend as much time on this because most of the Europeans didn't encounter these Indians until a bit later on. If they encountered anybody early on, it would have been the mound builders. The French certainly found these as they came down the St. Lawrence River and up the Mississippi. The Indians, mound builders, or the Mississippian culture, were known for the great earthen mounds that they would build, hence the term mound builders. And they extended, these Native Americans extended all the way from Ohio, Minnesota area in the north to Louisiana in the south. They were to the west of the Eastern Woodlands Indians. The mounds themselves served as things like temples and as homes for some of the tribe's leaders, the various priests and whatnot. And the tallest mound would be for the chief priest. Often when a functionary or priest died, his temple or home would be leveled at the top of the mound and then covered with more earth for the next priest or functionary who would, it means an ever-increasing size of a mound over the generations. A lot of these mounds were usually four-sided and flat-topped and a house built on top. The largest mounds would overlook a town plaza, which was the center of the tribe's activities, and all around the mounds and the plaza were the wood and mud thatched structures of the everyday people. The whole complex was often surrounded by a wooden wall sort of to protect it all. The mounds, as I say, could take generations to build and sometimes a century more, and it kind of reminds me of like the Egyptian pyramids. Individual workers would carry 60-pound baskets of soil working up in stages and so forth. Many of the mounds were strategically placed in regard to the sun rays, not unlike Stonehenge in England, which took place about the same time. Not all of the mound builders or Mississippian Indians' mounds were square and flat at the top. Some of the mounds were constructed in the shape of animals that were important to the culture, such as a serpent. You can see it here. It's a park, and you can see the park services put a walkway over it, but you can still see the outline of a snake there. The mounds were so impressive that when the Europeans saw them, they couldn't believe that the mound building culture had built them. They assumed either they'd found the lost tribes of Israel or the workings of earlier Vikings who had been there. The mound builders were a little more advanced than the Eastern Woodlands Indians in developing their land, obviously. Their large mounds and cities were engineering marvels. The mound building or Mississippian culture thrived from around 3500 BC to right about the time that the Europeans arrived on the East Coast. And at one point, the culture included the city of Cahokia, which was at its peak between 600 and 1400 AD. At that time, Cahokia had 40,000 inhabitants, which was larger than almost all the cities in Europe at that time. And it had more than 80 separate mounds. Today, it's a historic state landmark near Collinsville, Illinois. Cahokia, Illinois covered at the time 6 square miles, and keeping all these people together, it takes some civil engineering. It meant that they had to provide sufficient fresh water, and they had to have sufficient sewage removal, and obviously the food supplies to sustain the population. So these people are fairly advanced. Most of the major towns tended to be centered around river basins. Rivers are so important to transportation and trading of the Mississippian peoples. And the mound building people, they would form confederacies ruled by a chief priest. And they had a really intricate system of trading and were very accomplished craftsmen. They traded things like metals and textiles and pearls with Native Americans as far west as the Rocky Mountains. Within these confederacies, there was usually a hierarchy of towns, And Choke, of course, at its peak was the top town. It fell apart. We're not sure quite why it fell apart about 1400, but theories range from a combination of overhunting, deforestation, disease, and flooding. If you begin to move further west on the Mississippian or the mound building Native Americans, you hit the Great Plains and the Great Plains Indians there. Now, of course, on the Great Plains, there was a lack of trees and water was scarce. And together with the hard soil, meant that the Indians, their culture, they didn't have a lot of agriculture and they were nomadic. They moved according to the season, following the animals they hunted. Most notably were the American bison or buffalo. Buffalo herds could include thousands of animals, and they would stretch for miles. Still, the shortage of water and other environmental amenities meant there was hard competition between these various Great Plains Indians. And as a result, the Great Plains Indians tended to be some of the most warlike and fierce of all the North American Native Americans. In this environment of scarcity, the Great Plains Native Americans used all part of the buffalo. They had the hide for the clothing, or the bones for cooking and other implements, and the muscles and other internal organs for meat. It was, of course, the Great Plains Native Americans who lived in tepees. And these were, again, perfectly adapted to the environment of the Great Plains. There wasn't a lot of trees, so it didn't use a lot of trees. You would have some wood that you'd carry with you, and you'd put it together at the top, and then put a buffalo hide or what around it, creating a shelter. And smoke could leave through the top. And this could then be disassembled, and the hides tied around the poles, and the poles could be used as sleds when they were following the buffalo herd. Keep in mind that they didn't have wheels, and they didn't have horses until the Europeans arrived. But this was well adapted, and like all the Native Americans, they adapted well to their environment. Again, moving further southwest into part of what is now, Arizona, New Mexico, that area. It's obviously hot and arid, and includes mountains and deserts. And the Native Americans that lived there were generally known as the Anasazi or the Pueblo Indians. The Anasazi was a Navajo word meaning ancient ones. The first Anasazi were known as the basket makers. And that basket maker culture probably thrived from about 6000 BC to about 700 AD. And they tended to settle more in the northern regions of the Southwest. At first, these basket making culture lived in caves, but they soon progressed to shelters of adobe mud or pits dug in the ground, covered with a roof of wood or twigs or grass. And you'd enter the house by climbing down a ladder. Obviously, in a cave or a dugout, you would have a cooler area to live in the hot heat, and they could store their food or their dead there in underground pits. At first, these early Anasazi or Pueblo Indians, the Pueblo is a word that became to describe these adobe or baked clay houses, but these early Anasazi or Pueblo Indians, known as the basket makers, they too were perfectly aligned with their environment, and they tended to be hunters and food gatherers, but they didn't have a whole lot to grow. They grew pumpkins and a little bit of corn to supplement their diet. In time, the basket maker culture became more developed and gets what we know as the full Anasazi or Pueblo Indian culture, and they developed these Pueblo houses in large numbers. By 400, 500 AD, you really see permanent villages of adobe houses, and you can still see remnants of these small villages of adobe houses throughout the canyons and mazes of places like southern Utah and New Mexico today. Because of the scarcity of their environment, the Pueblo Indians, the Anasazi Indians, were famous for their decorated weaved baskets, and painted baked clay jugs, which are obviously used to store limited supplies of food and water. And again, I've already just mentioned that the early Anasazi or Pueblo Indians were known as the basket makers. But this pottery was pretty incredible. They would paint distinctive designs on them, and these pueblos, like, to go back to that, they grew incredibly large. They could be multi-storied, up to 5 stories, and have some of the largest had over 800 rooms. And in the basements they would use as chapels, or set aside as religious ceremonies. And anyway, you can see, as I say, these Pueblo Indians, the Pueblos, these old abandoned Pueblos, are national parks in that part of the country today. When you look at these old Pueblo villages today, you can see again how well adapted the environment they were. They made elaborate, impressive irrigation canals, as you would expect for the arid Southwest. And their basements in these big Pueblo houses, they were designed to preserve heat and cool and whatever was needed for their food and survival. It's just really impressive. And we're talking about in the Southwest today, you can only see some of these old Pueblos, but that style is popular with many modern homes. They kind of model it on the old Pueblo style. You can see a couple of pictures of it here. You may be familiar, as I said at the outset, with the Native American nations in Central and South America, again, where most of the Native Americans at the time of European arrival were located, the Mayan, the Incas, and so forth. In fact, as I've said, they were not only more numerous, but much more advanced than those in North America. And this too was due to their environment. They're warmer. And anyway, we're not going to discuss a whole lot of these Central and South American Native Americans, as I said at the outset, because the focus is on the United States. So with that in mind, this concludes the last of the 4 videos on Native American culture about the time of European arrival.